Welcome back. Today we're making CuMai. We're going to make two blades. One is for a 6-inch knife. The other is a 7-inch blade that I'm going to ship to a customer to put his own handle on. If you like these, please like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. Right in. Step one is to make the Damascus. We're going to make 18 layers of 15 and 20 and 1084. I'm using thicker layers of 1084 so I can get a little bit more darkness in the blade. But when I squish it out, you'll see it comes out pretty even. I'll weld up the ends, and I don't really care that I'm using a stick because I'm going to cut it off. But when I do the center seam to stop the billet from spreading apart as it heats up, I'm going to use the MIG welder without any filler. I'm just going to simply melt it together on the edge so I don't have to grind it off later. If you do like these, help me out by hitting that like and subscribe button. I'm going to throw it in the forge, but we ended up with a problem today. There is a windstorm outside with winds reaching 60-70 miles per hour. And what happens is the power goes out as I'm heating up the billet. I was really worried that with the billet heated up to about 1200 degrees and then the power going out, my ribbon burner forge has to shut down because there's no air blowing. I didn't know if I just ruined the billet or not. When the power came on, I pressed forward and started reheating and setting the welds again, but I took a little bit more time setting those welds. It turned out there wasn't much oxidation there because it did work in the end. With the welds set, it's time to draw out this billet. There's a lot more steel than I need here for a 4-inch knife, but this is actually going to be the steel for 3 different knives that I'm making. So we'll cut a little bit off at the end. With the steel drawn out, time to just clean it up, cut it up, restack it, and back in the forge. I do have to admit, if you're making some tools, a surface grinder attachment for your 2x72 is a great tool to have. We'll cut up our bar in 5 sections to give us 90 layers. When we put this all together, we're going to have 90 layers on each side, plus the center steel, plus the copper. So we'll have 180 layers of Damascus in total. Throw this new billet back in the fire, draw it out, and now we have a long bar of 90 layer Damascus. Time to make the CuMai now. We're going to use 0.4 millimeter copper in between the 2 layers of Damascus and a 1/4 inch piece of 1084. When we do CuMai, we have to completely weld it up so we get an airtight seam. This isn't really to stop the air, it's more to stop any copper from potentially leaking out. Just like when we make Damascus, it's not really setting the welds so much as ensuring everything's nice and tight. But I'm going to be gentle on the first few passes just to make sure everything is squished down tight. Now my billet here is really wide, so I'm going to actually have to draw it out quite a bit before we add length to it. I ended up making some widening dies for my press. Here I'm only using 1/2 of the die just to control how far I'm actually spreading out the steel and making sure I don't overpress the copper. The other thing I'm doing is making sure I press each side the same amount. So I flip it over each time I go back to the press. With the billet wide enough, the next step is to actually put some of those waves into the copper. And to do that, I'm going to use the drawing dies, and about every 1/2 inch give it a little bit of a squeeze. Now what that's going to do is give us that heartbeat pattern in the copper. The last step is to simply draw it out to about a 1/4 inch thick in total. And I haven't gone completely flat. If you look here, you'll see little ridges from the press. I actually want those because when I sand them off, it'll almost be a little bit like a ladder pattern. mild, but it'll be there. I'm going to use the angle grinder to take off the scale. I'll give a shout out to OG the Frenchie. He's the guy that turned me on to these humongous grinding discs, although they do wear out fast, I'll say that. I'm going to have to work out the economics of this because I was surprised how fast this disc actually wears down. But you can see, now that we're down to metal, my welds actually held up pretty good through the pressing process. We'll take it over to the grinder so that we can smooth it out and get ready to start tracing our templates onto the billets. Because it is CuMai, we cannot forge to shape. We'll separate that copper if we do that. Now it's time to do some stock removal. We go back to the grinder to grind out our shapes. You'll notice I've left the tangs really wide. I haven't ground them quite down yet. I'm going to do that after heat treat. I've found with CuMai, if I get too narrow of a part, there's a good chance it can separate during the quenching process. But before we quench, the last thing we have to do is drill any holes in the tangs that we need. Both of these knives are going to have mosaic pins, so I want to make sure I get those holes drilled before we quench. With the holes drilled, it's time to heat treat. I'm going to coat everything with no scale, and then we'll start the normalization process. We'll normalize at 1600 degrees, 1500 degrees, and 1425 degrees. I'll do 3 cycles with a soak time of about 15 minutes each. That's just enough to make sure it goes through the blade. Let it air cool to about 200 degrees between each cycle. And now, time to quench. I'm using Parks 50 to quench these. We're putting them in at about 1500 degrees, soaking them for about 30 seconds. And the first one comes out nice and straight. And the second one's good too. No pings, no cracks, no warps. I like it. We'll check the hardness just to make sure our quench worked. I'll use these hardness testing files. I'm going to start at 55 and it just skates across. So we'll try 60, see what happens there. Might have a bit of a bite here, and 65 definitely bites. So I'm guessing we're probably pretty close in on 60, 61, somewhere in there. And we'll do a little bit of baking or normalization. We'll throw it in the oven at 390 degrees 2 times for 2 hours. We'll check the hardness again. 55 skates pretty good. 60 bites a little bit more than it used to, so I think we're probably just under 60 if I had to guess. Back to the grinder to forge in the bevels and start revealing some of that copper. With everything nice and flat, we'll actually now mark in those tangs, grind them down to shape, and start putting in some bevels after that. Smaller blade has a swedge or a false edge. I always grind those in first and then pull the bevel up to the swedge. When I'm grinding this, what I'm doing is varying the pressure. Light at the tip, light at the top, heavy in the middle. That gives me that nice crescent shape for the swedge. I find when grinding CuMai, one of the things you have to do is watch your temperatures. Steel and copper heat up at different rates, and the last thing you want to do is create any more stress between those layers and have them potentially separate on you. So lots of dunking when you're grinding. I always get excited when I'm grinding and I see that copper start to peek through. I'm trying to keep that 1084 steel in the center of the blade, and you see that copper rise up on the edge. I'm going to take a quick pass on this with 220 grit sandpaper just so that we can have a peek. I just can't wait to see what this one's going to look like. Yes, I am really happy with how these two turned out. Nice dark blacks from that extra 1084 we were throwing in, heartbeat pattern on the copper. They look fantastic. Stay tuned and we'll go through the handle construction for the knife on the left.